The Story of the Third Dutch War by Alfred H. Miles. B.Y. John Campbell. The Battle of Solebay, the story of the Earl of Sandwich, the invasion of Holland. We come now to the story of the Third Dutch War, perhaps more frequently called the Second, from the fact that it was the second war with Holland in the reign of Charles II. War was declared by Charles on the 28th of March, 1672, Louis XIV. Of France agreeing to join with the English against the Dutch, and sending the Count d'Estrées, Vice-Admiral of France with a large squadron, to join the English fleet. The French squadron arrived at St. Helens on the 3rd of May, and the king immediately went down to Portsmouth, and, to show his confidence in his new ally, went on board the French admiral, where he remained some hours. The English fleet sailed to the Downs, the Duke of York, as High Admiral, wearing the red, and the Earl of Sandwich, the blue. Here the French squadron joined them, their admiral bearing the white flag, the united fleet consisting of 101 sail of men of war, besides fireships and tenders. Of these the English had 65 ships of war, carrying 4,092 pieces of cannon and 23,530 men. The French squadron consisted of 36 sail, on board of which were 1,926 pieces of cannon and about 11,000 men. The Dutch, in the meantime, were at sea with a very considerable fleet, consisting of 91 stout men of war, 54 fireships, and 23 yachts. On May the 9th they were seen off Dover, and the 13th of the same month a Dutch squadron chased the Gloucester, and some other ships, under the cannon of Sheerness. The English fleet were at anchor in Solebay on May 28th, when the Dutch fell in with them, and, if they had not spent too much time in council, had entirely surprised them. As it was, many of the English captains were forced to cut their cables, in order to get into the line in time for the battle. The engagement began between 7 and 8 in the morning, when de Ruyter attacked the Red Squadron in the center, and engaged the admiral, on board of which was the Duke of York, for 2 hours, forcing His Highness at last to remove to another ship. The Dutch captain, Van Brakel, attacked the Earl of Sandwich in the Royal James, and while they were engaged, almost all the squadron of Van Ghent fell upon the Earl's ships. His lordship behaved with amazing intrepidity, killed Admiral Van Ghent with his own hands, sank 3 fireships and a man-of-war that would have laid him on board. But when he had lost all his officers and 2/3 of his men, his battered ship was grappled and set on fire by a 4th fireship. In this distress, it is said, he might have been relieved by his vice-admiral, Sir Joseph Jordan, if Sir Joseph had not been more solicitous about assisting the Duke. It is said that, when the Earl saw Sir Joseph sail by, heedless of the condition in which he lay, he said to those about him, "There is nothing left for us now but to defend the ship to the last man," and those who knew him best knew quite well that by the last man he meant himself. When the 4th fireship had grappled him, he begged his captain, Sir Richard Haddock, and all his servants, to get into the boat and save themselves, which they did. But many of his men would not leave their admiral, and continued to make fruitless efforts to quench the fire until the ship blew up about noon. The death of Van Ghent, with the furious attack of part of the Blue Squadron, coming in, though too late, to the Earl of Sandwich's assistance, threw this part of the Dutch fleet into very great confusion and forced them to stand off. This gave an opportunity for the Blue Squadron to join the Red and to assist the Duke of York, who, deserted by the French, was in the utmost danger of being destroyed by the 2 squadrons of de Ruyter and Bankert. About this time Cornelius Everts, Vice-Admiral of Zeeland, was killed, and de Ruyter and Allemande narrowly escaped being burnt by fireships. But when the English thought themselves secure of victory, the scattered squadron of Van Ghent came in to the assistance of their countrymen, and again rendered doubtful the fortune of the day. It is said that all this time the French, who composed the White Squadron, instead of seconding the efforts of the English, kept as far out of danger as they could, and left our fleet to sustain the whole force of the enemy at a disadvantage of 3-2. But notwithstanding this inequality of numbers, the fight continued with inexpressible obstinacy till towards the evening, when victory declared for the English. 5 or 6 of the enemy's fireships were sunk by an English man-of-war, and Sir Joseph Jordan of the Blue Squadron, having the advantage of the wind, pierced the Dutch fleet, and thereby spread through it the utmost confusion, while a fireship clapped their admiral, de Ruyter, on board, and was, with the utmost difficulty, repulsed. As it grew dark, de Ruyter, collecting his fleet in the best order he could, fought retreating and steered northwards. The loss was pretty equal on both sides. The English had 4 men-of-war sunk or disabled, but they were small ships, whereas the Dutch lost 3 of the best in their fleet, one sunk, another burnt, and a third taken. A fourth, called the Great Holland, commanded by the brave Captain Brakel, was entirely disabled. As for the French, notwithstanding all their caution, they lost 2 men of war and their rear admiral, M. de la Rabinière. Of the English, about 2,500 were killed and as many wounded. The Dutch did not publish any list, though their loss without question must have been as great, since de Ruyter says in his letter, it was the hardest fought battle that he ever saw. But though losses were reckoned as pretty equal on either side, the loss of the Royal James with its 100 guns, its 800 men, and its admiral, the Earl of Sandwich, who was probably without his equal upon the sea at this time, was loss enough, as the Duke of Buckingham observed, to give the name of victory to the Dutch. The Earl, a son of Sir Sidney Montague, born on July 27, 1625, had rendered a great deal of distinguished service. On August 20th, 1643, when no more than 18 years of age, he received a commission to raise and command a regiment in the parliamentary interest in the Civil War. He was present at the storming of Lincoln, on the 6th of May, 1644, which was one of the warmest actions in the course of the war. He was likewise in the Battle of Marston Moor, which was fought on July the 2nd of the same year, where he greatly distinguished himself, insomuch that soon after, when the city of York demanded to capitulate, he was appointed one of the commissioners for settling the articles, which must have been the pure effect of personal ability, since he was then but in his 19th year. We find him next in the Battle of Naseby, and in the month of July, 1645, he stormed the town of Bridgewater. In September, he commanded a brigade in the storming of Bristol, where he performed very remarkable service, and on September 10, 1645, subscribed the Articles of the Capitulation, granted to Prince Rupert on the delivery of that important place to the Parliament. After the First Dutch War was over, he was brought into a command of the fleet, and was appointed by the Protector to act with Blake in his expedition into the Mediterranean. In 1657, he was appointed to command the fleet in the Downs, and in the following year, on the death of Oliver, had command of the great fleet sent to the north to preserve the tranquillity of Europe, returning from whence he gave an account of his conduct to Parliament, and then retired to his own estate. On the restoration of Charles Roman II, he was made Earl of Sandwich, Admiral of the Narrow Seas, and Lieutenant Admiral to the Duke of York as Lord High Admiral of England. The story of his career from this time forward has been told in the successive stories of the Dutch wars, and it only remains now to record the last honors done to his remains. His body was found, nearly a fortnight after his death, floating in the sea, and the king testified, by the honors he paid to his remains, how much he admired the man, how sensible he was of his hard fate, and how willing he was to mingle with the dust of his ancestors the ashes of such as died gloriously in their country's service. The facts stand thus recorded in the Gazette of June 13, 1672. This day the body of the Right Honourable Edward, Earl of Sandwich, being, by the order upon his coat, discovered floating on the sea, by one of his Majesty's ketches was taken up and brought into this port, where Sir Charles Littleton, the governor, receiving it, took immediate care for its embalming and honourable disposing, till his Majesty's pleasure should be known concerning it, for the obtaining of which his Majesty was attended at Whitehall, the next day, by the master of the said vessel, who, by Sir Charles Littleton's order, was sent to present his Majesty with the George found about the body of the said Earl, who remained, at the time of its taking up, in every part unblemished, saving some impressions made by the fire upon his face and breast, upon which his Majesty, out of his princely regard to the great deservings of the said Earl, and his unexampled performances in this last act of his life, hath resolved to have his body brought up to London, there, at his charge, to receive the rites of funeral due to his great quality and merits. The Earl of Sandwich's body being taken out of one of his Majesty's yachts at Diptford on July 3rd, 1672, and laid in the most solemn manner in a sumptuous barge, proceeded by water to Westminster Bridge, attended by the King's barges, His Royal Highness the Duke of York's, as also with the several barges of the nobility, Lord Mayor, and the several companies of the City of London, adorned suitable to the melancholy occasion, with trumpets and other music that sounded the deepest notes. On passing by the Tower, the great guns there were discharged, as well as at Whitehall, and about 5 o'clock in the evening, the body being taken out of the barge at Westminster Bridge, there was a procession to the Abbey Church with the highest magnificence. 8 earls were assistant to his son Edward, Earl of Sandwich, chief mourner, and most of the nobility and persons of quality in town gave their assistance to his interment in the Duke of Albemarle's vault, in the north side of King Henry VII's chapel, where his remains are deposited. After the Battle of Solebay, the Dutch fleet returned to the coast of Holland, where they were obliged to lay up for the want of powder, all available ammunition being wanted by the land forces to dispute the victorious march of the French. In their extremity, the Dutch sued for peace and sent 4 deputies to England and as many to the French king. At both courts they were treated with the same scant courtesy. Charles Roman II, instead of hearing and giving them an answer in person, sent 4 of his ministers to confer with them, and afterwards sent the Duke of Buckingham, the Earl of Arlington, and Viscount Halifax into Holland to treat with them there. These ambassadors made most extravagant demands, asking 10 millions of guilders for the expense of the war, an annual tribute of 100,000 for the liberty of fishing, and the perpetual stadholdership for the Prince of Orange and his issue mail. These, however, were moderate articles in comparison with the rest, for they insisted on a share in the Dutch East India trade, the possession of the city of Sluys in Flanders, and the islands of Cadzand, Walcheren, Goree, and Voorn. The deputies sent to the French court were answered in the style of a conqueror, and so sent back to spread despair through the country, whereupon the Dutch, seeing nothing before them but slavery, resolved to lay aside all treaties and to die free. In the meantime, the French and English fleets, being perfectly refitted, and the latter having taken on board a large body of land forces, sailed again for the Dutch coasts, with a design to make a descent on Zeeland, the only province into which the French had not carried their arms by land. Here they found the Dutch fleet, but not thinking proper to attack them among the sands, they deferred the execution of their design and blocked up the Meese and Texel, which de Ruyter, having strict orders to avoid battle, saw with concern, yet wanted power to prevent. The Duke of York now resolved to disembark his troops on the Isle of Texel. The occasion was favorable in all respects. The French and the Bishop of Munster were in the heart of the Dutch territories, so that no great force could be drawn together to resist the English on shore, and the coast was so low and flat that it looked as if nothing could secure the Dutch from invasion. It was upon July 3rd this resolution was taken, and it was intended that the forces should have landed the next flood. But at this critical juncture, wind and wave interposed in favor of a free people, and saved them from a yoke which seemed already to press upon their necks. The ebb continued much longer than usual, and this defeated the intended descent for that time. And the storm, that rose the night following, forced the fleet out to sea, where they struggled for some time with very foul weather, and then returned to the English shore. The Dutch clergy magnified this circumstance into a miracle, and certainly it was a good stroke of policy at such a time to persuade the nation, struggling against superior enemies, that they were particularly favored by heaven. After this disappointment, there was no other action thought of at sea for this year, except the sending Sir Edward Spragge, with a squadron, to disturb the Dutch herring fishery, which he performed with a degree of moderation that became so great a man, contenting himself with taking one of their vessels, when he saw that was sufficient to disperse the rest. All this time affairs in England were getting into very strained conditions. The Parliament had never owned the Dutch war, and though they voted liberal supplies to the king, did so without naming the object to which they were to be applied further than to designate them, the king's extraordinary occasions. At this time, too, the Test Act was passed, an act which, putting it out of the power of the papists to continue in public offices, compelled Lord Clifford to quit the Treasury and the Duke of York to give up the fleet. Early in the year 1673, it was resolved that Prince Rupert should succeed the Duke of York at the head of the fleet, and by the middle of May, he was ready for sea. The object of the English was to make another attempt to land troops upon the Dutch coast, and, with this view, a considerable number of soldiers was put on board the fleet. Charles Roman II and the Duke of York visited the navy on May 19th, and in a council of war held in their presence, it was resolved to attack the enemy even upon their own coast, in case they could not be provoked to put to sea. In pursuance of this determination, Prince Rupert stood over towards the coast of Holland, and found de Ruyter with the Dutch fleet riding within the sands of Schoonveld, in a line between the Rand and the Stony Bank, which was a very advantageous situation. On the 28th, in the morning about 9 o'clock, Prince Rupert sent a detached squadron of 35 frigates and 13 fireships to draw the enemy out, which was very easily done. For de Ruyter presently advanced in good order, and, the English light ships retreating, put their own fleet in some disarray. This engagement took place upon very unequal terms. The Confederate fleet consisted of 84 men of war, besides fireships, divided into 3 squadrons, under the command of Prince Rupert, Count d'Estrées, and Sir Edward Spragge. The Dutch were scarcely 70 men of war and frigates, under de Ruyter, Tromp, and Bankert. The battle was very hard fought on both sides, insomuch that Tromp shifted his flag 4 times, from the Golden Lion to the Prince on Horseback, from the Prince on Horseback to the Amsterdam, and from the Amsterdam to the Comet, from on board which he dated his letter to the States in the evening. Sir Edward Spragge and the Earl of Ossory distinguished themselves on our side by their extraordinary courage and conduct. Prince Rupert also performed wonders, considering that his ship was in a very bad condition, and took in so much water at her ports that she could not fire the guns of her lower tier. The battle lasted till night, and then the Dutch are said to have retired behind their sands. Both sides, however, claimed the victory. De Ruyter, in his letter to the Prince of Orange, says, "We judge absolutely that the victory is on the side of the state and of your highness." Prince Rupert, in his letter to the Earl of Arlington, says, "I thought it best to cease the pursuit and anchor where I now am." As to the slain on both sides in this battle, it is reported the Dutch lost Vice Admiral Schramm, Rear Admiral Vlug, and 6 of their captains, and had 1 ship disabled which was lost in her retreat. On our side fell the captains Fowles, Finch, Tempest, and Worden. Colonel Hamilton had his legs shot off, and we had only 2 ships disabled, none either sunk or taken. In one respect, however, the Dutch may certainly be credited with victory, since they prevented a descent intended upon their country, which was the main object of the attack, and for which service, in case of the victory of the English fleet, Count Skommerg, with 6,000 men, lay ready at Yarmouth. The Dutch, being upon their own coast, had the advantage of receiving quick supplies, whereas the wind prevented the English from obtaining succor. Prince Rupert, however, did all in his power to repair his fleet, and believing that the Dutch would not be long before they resumed hostilities, he went on board the Royal Sovereign in the evening of June 3rd, where he went not to bed all night. His foresight was justified by events, for on the 4th, in the morning, the Dutch fleet, by this time at least as strong as the Confederates, bore down upon them as fast as the wind would permit. Prince Rupert was so much in earnest that, finding his ship's crew raised his anchors very slowly, he ordered his cables to be cut, that he might make haste to meet the Dutch. Count d'Estrées, with the White Squadron, is said to have betrayed no such great willingness to fight, but to have kept as much as might be out of harm's way. At last, about 5 in the evening, Spragge and Tromp engaged with great fury. De Ruyter showed at first a design of coming to a close engagement with the prince, but before he came within musket shot, he tacked and bore away, whence it was concluded that he had suffered some considerable damage. Spragge, in the meantime, had forced Tromp to sheer off. He then fell into Vice Admiral Sweers's division, which he soon put to confusion, and had a third engagement with Tromp, wherein he shot down his flag. The battle lasted till between 10 and 11 at night, and then the Dutch stood to the southeast, and so it ended. Both sides claimed the victory as before, losses being pretty equal on both sides, though far from considerable on either. The prince was for attacking the enemy again, but it was carried in a council of war to sail for the English coast, in order to obtain supplies, as well of ammunition as provision, of the want of which a great many captains complained loudly. Besides, the fleet was so poorly manned that if it had not been for the land forces on board they could not have fought at all. On June the 8th the fleet arrived at the Nore, and on the 14th Prince Rupert went to London, to give the king an account of the condition of things, and to press for necessary supplies. About the middle of July, Prince Rupert was once more at sea, having on board the troops intended for a descent upon the Dutch coast. His Highness arrived off Holland on the 21st of the said month, and, declining an engagement, stood along the shore in order to find an opportunity for disembarking his troops. On August the 9th, he took a Dutch East India ship richly laden. This induced de Ruyter to bear down upon the English fleet, upon seeing which, Prince Rupert commanded the French a particular course, and had thereby an opportunity of discerning what he was to expect from them in a time of action. They lay by twice that night, first about 11 o'clock, when the prince sent to Count d'Estrées to order him to make sail, which he did till about 1 o'clock, and then laid his sail to the mast again, causing a second stop to the fleet, and obliging the prince to send him another message. In those days, when party spirit ran very high, nobody ever suspected the Count d'Estrées' courage, which was so well known and so thoroughly established as clearly to disclose his orders. These delays gave the Dutch admiral an opportunity of gaining the wind, which he did not neglect, but early on August 11th bore down upon the Confederates as if he meant to force them to a battle, upon which His Highness thought fit to tack, and thereby brought the fleet into good order. He put the French in the van, himself in the center, and Sir Edward Spragge in the rear. And in this disposition the French lay fair to get the wind of the enemy, which, however, they neglected. The English fleet consisted of about 60 men of war and frigates, the French of 30, and the Dutch of 70 or thereabouts, so that the royal fleets were indisputably superior to that of the Republic. De Ruyter, bearing down with his fleet in 3 squadrons, prepared to attack the prince himself, while Tromp engaged Spragge and the Blue Squadron, in which the English admiral obliged him, by laying his foretop sail to his mast in order to stay for him, contrary to the express order of the prince. This fondness for a point of honor proved fatal to himself, as well as disadvantageous to the fleet. Bankert with his Zealand squadron should have engaged the White, commanded by 500 estuaries, but it seems the Dutch understood the temper of the French better than to give themselves much trouble about them. For Bankert contented himself with sending 8 men of war and 3 fireships to attack the rear admiral, de Martel, who seemed to be the only man that had any real design to fight, and then the rest of the Zealand squadron united themselves to de Ruyter, and fell together upon Prince Rupert. The battle between de Ruyter and the Red Squadron began about 8 o'clock in the morning, and a multitude of circumstances concurred to threaten the English admiral with inevitable ruin. Sir Edward Spragge, intent on his personal quarrel with Van Tromp, had fallen to the leeward several leagues with the Blue Squadron, and to complete Prince Rupert's misfortune, the enemy found means to intercept his own rear admiral, Sir John Chichele, with his division, so that by noon His Highness was wholly surrounded by the Dutch, being pressed by de Ruyter and his division on his lee quarter, an admiral with 2 flags more on his weather quarter, and the Zealand squadron on his broadside to windward. His Highness, in the midst of these disappointments, behaved with such intrepidity, and encouraged all his officers so effectually by his own example that by degrees he cleared himself of his enemies, rejoined Sir John Chichele, and by 2 o'clock had time to think of the Blue Squadron, which was now at 3 leagues' distance. And not hearing their guns well plied, he made all the sail he could towards them, in order to unite with and relieve them. De Ruyter, perceiving His Highness's design, left firing and bore away also with his whole force to the assistance of Tromp, so that both fleets ran down side by side within range of cannon shot, and yet without firing on either part. About 4 the prince joined the Blue Squadron, which he found in a very tattered condition. At the beginning of the fight, Tromp in the Golden Lion and Sir Edward Spragge in the Royal Prince fought ship to ship. The Dutch admiral, however, would not come to a close fight, which gave him a great advantage. For Spragge, who had more than his complement on board, suffered much by the enemy's cannon, and, having the wind and smoke in his face, could not make such good use of his own as he would otherwise have done. After 3 hours' warm fighting, the Royal Prince was so disabled that Sir Edward was forced to go on board the St. George, and Tromp quitted his Golden Lion to hoist his flag on board the Comet, when the battle was renewed with incredible fury. The great aim of the Dutch admiral was to take or sink the Royal Prince, but the Earl of Ossory and Sir John Kempthorne, together with Spragge himself, so effectually protected the disabled vessel that none of the enemy's fireships could come near her, though they often attempted it. At last, the St. George being terribly torn and disabled, Sir Edward Spragge designed to go on board a 3rd ship, the Royal Charles. But before he had got 10 boats' length, a shot which passed through the St. George took his boat, and though they immediately rowed back, before they could get within reach of the ropes that were thrown out from the St. George, the boat sank and Sir Edward was drowned. When Prince Rupert drew near the Blue Squadron, he found the admiral disabled, the vice-admiral lying to the windward, mending his sails and rigging, the rear-admiral astern of the Royal Prince, between her and the enemy, bending his new sails and mending his rigging. The first thing His Highness did was to send 2 frigates to take the Royal Prince in tow. He then steered in between the enemy and the lame ships, and perceiving that Tromp had tacked and was coming down again upon the Blue Squadron, he made a signal for all the ships of that squadron to join him. But it was in vain, for, except the 2 flags, Sir John Kempthorne and the Earl of Ossory, there was not one in a condition to move. The French still continued to look on with all the coolness imaginable, and notwithstanding the prince put out the blue flag upon the Mizen Peak, which was the signal to attack set down in the general instructions for fighting, and known not only to all the English captains, but also to those of the White Squadron. Yet they remained, as before, wholly inactive. But to give some kind of color to this conduct, the Count d'Estrées, after the battle was in a manner over, sent to know what this signal meant. An officer who wrote an account of this engagement says, The sending to inquire the meaning of the signal was cunningly done, but one of de Ruyter's sailors seems to have had as much penetration as the French ministry had artifice. For upon one of his companions asking him what the French meant by keeping at such a distance, "Why, you fool," said he, "they have hired the English to fight for them, and all their business here is to see that they earn their wages." About 5 in the evening, de Ruyter, with all his flags and fleet, came close up with the prince, and then began a very sharp engagement. His Highness had none to second him but the Vice-Admiral and Rear-Admiral of the Blue, Sir John Harmon, Captain Davis, and Captain Stout of his own division, Sir John Holmes in the Rupert, Captain Legg in the Royal Catharine, Sir John Barry in the Resolution, Sir John Ernle in the Henry, Sir Roger Strickland in the Mary, and Captain Carter in the Crown, in all about 13 ships. The engagement was very close and bloody till about 7 o'clock, when His Highness forced the Dutch fleet into great disorder and sent in 2 fireships amongst them to increase it, at the same time making a signal for the French to bear down, which, even then, if they had done, a total defeat must have followed. But, as they took no notice of it, and the prince saw that most of his ships were not in any condition to keep the sea long, he wisely provided for their safety by making with an easy sail toward our own coasts. This battle ended as doubtfully as any of the rest, for the Dutch very loudly claimed the victory now, as they did before, and with fully as much reason. The truth is, it seems to have been a drawn battle, since the Dutch, notwithstanding all their advantages, did not take or sink a single English man-of-war, and killed but 2 captains, Sir William Reeves and Captain Havard, besides our gallant admiral, Sir Edward Spragg, and no great number of private men. On their side they lost 2 vice-admirals, Sweers and Leeft, 3 captains, and about 1,000 private men. Soon after this battle, the English fleet came into the Thames, and Prince Rupert returned to court, where he joined his representations to those of others who were desirous for peace. The result of which was that a treaty of peace was signed in London on February 9, 1674, whereby all differences were adjusted. The limits of the British seas were particularly defined, and the states undertook that not only separate ships, but whole fleets should strike their sails to any fleet or single ship carrying the king's flag, as the custom was in the days of his ancestors. The East India trade was likewise settled so as to prevent subsequent debates, and not leave either party at liberty to encroach upon the other. Places taken on both sides were by this treaty to be restored, and the States General were to pay His Majesty 800,000 patacoons at 4 payments. The first, immediately after the ratification of this treaty, and the other 3 by annual payments. Thus ended the third of our Dutch wars, which, though made against the interest and will of the people, terminated to their advantage, whereas the former war, begun at the instance of the nation, ended but indifferently. So little correspondence is there between the grounds and issues of things.